Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the $5.2 billion of taxpayer funds the Illinois Auditor General found the state's unemployment agency overspent during the COVID-19 pandemic, including tens of millions to some who are incarcerated or dead. We'll also hear about the new contract the Pritzker administration entered with the AFSCME union. I'll then join the Center Square's executive editor Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. An Illinois Auditor General report shows billions of dollars were overpaid, including tens of millions to people behind bars or deceased during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Legislators are calling for accountability. The audit released Wednesday examines the Illinois Department of Employment Security from 2020 through 2022 and highlights their handling of the state's unemployment funds. The report shows the state made around $5.2 billion in improper payments and made $40 million worth of payments to those incarcerated. State Representative Dan Calkins says this is a criminal act.
They ought to be sued. They ought to be sued for not performing, honoring their contract. I mean, this is criminal.
State Senator Chapin Rose says it's more frustrating knowing some of his constituents who needed the help never got it.
Somebody who filled out all the forms and did all the paperwork and never got one red cent from the state of Illinois when they needed it most, how do you think they feel when they pick up the paper and find out that Pritzker lost billions of dollars?
The report also shows the state made $6 million payments to those who were deceased. Governor J.B. Pritzker announced the state's reached a final tentative agreement with some of the state's union workers with nearly 18% raises over the next 4 years. That's an extra taxpayer cost of more than $620 million. Andrew Hensel has that story.
Illinois' contract with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, or AFSCME, expired at the end of June. A tentative agreement on a new contract was announced Tuesday. Bryce Hill of the Illinois Policy Institute says a deal this large could have unfavorable consequences on the state's taxpayers.
The private sector wage increases are not keeping up with this contract, which means taxpayers are going to see a larger share of their paycheck going towards subsidizing these pay raises in the AFSCME contract.
Pritzker said the contract represents a partnership that won't just expand the pool of state employees, but will strengthen state workers and provide opportunity for employees and their families. I'm Andrew Hensel.
And those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Freedom, individualism, limited government. On these issues, conservatives and libertarians generally agree. But where do we disagree? Check out the Future of Freedom podcast for civil, reasoned conversations about some of today's most pressing topics. It's not a debate. Our goal is to provide the best arguments from either side of an issue. Then you decide. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you find your podcasts.
Are you looking for fair news coverage out of the nation's capital? Join the Center Square's editor-in-chief Dan McCaleb and D.C. Bureau Chief Casey Harper as they discuss all things coming out of Washington, D.C.
And as you said, I did a fact check on this because I really found it pretty misleading. Gas prices, yes, are down. But if you look at food prices, they increased.
No spin, just the news. Listen to the America in Focus podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Greg Bishop, our Illinois Capitol Bureau senior reporter and editor. How are you, Greg?
I'm out here trying to clean up some mercury after my thermometer blew up. It's so stupid hot out. My gosh.
I hear you. You're in the Springfield area. I'm up in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, and it's blistering hot here as well. At least we're not in Texas or Arizona right now, where they're experiencing I don't know how many consecutive days of 100-degree weather.
Yeah, we're getting ready to have about 87 the high, but that's not till next week. That'll feel like the onset of fall after 90 plus degree temperatures with triple digit heat index.
I hear you, but just in a couple of months, we'll be complaining about the weather just in the opposite
exactly
direction.
Right.
Greg, we're recording this on Thursday, July 27th. It's been at least a couple of years now that we, particularly you and your team, Greg, have been pressing the Illinois Department of Employment Security for numbers on how much fraudulent unemployment benefits were paid out during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's, of course, when government restrictions on businesses and individuals resulted in massive spikes in unemployment claims. We have known how much fraud there has been in other state programs, but we finally learned this week what that number is here in Illinois. And it's quite staggering. Tell us about it.
Yeah, and I don't know if we know the exact number because there's still some of these metrics where there may have been some just poor reporting and recording of the numbers. The Illinois Department of Employment Security, and just a flashback, March of 2020, the governor issues the stay-at-home order as a way to try to slow the spread of COVID-19. We saw unemployment requests spike, and it went from 2,000 1 week normal to 6,000 to 10,000. I think for about 2 consecutive weeks, it was 200,000 people were requesting unemployment assistance. The unemployment offices were closed to the public. The phone lines were clogged up. People were waiting for hours on end only to be hung up on. We had people that didn't ask for unemployment assistance getting unemployment checks. We had Congress people complaining that they were being sent unemployment checks. There was a lot of questions of what in the world was going on with the unemployment system then, and not a lot of transparency as to how exactly the money was being doled out and whether or not it was legitimate. And questions of fraud began pretty early on, just with all of the different things that were happening with the unemployment system. So now fast forward, here we are well over 3 years over when the pandemic started and the economic reverberations from the government's decisions to close what they deemed non-essential businesses down. We see now a better picture. Is it the entire picture? That's a great question, but it's much bigger than what we had previously known, because even I want to say sometime last year, an Auditor General report came out of IDES that showed the potential of at least $2 billion in fraudulent payments. But even that report a year ago indicated that the record keeping was so poor that they couldn't really legitimize how much fraud there actually has been. So the bipartisan joint committee for audits, the Legislative Audit Committee, they actually did pass a resolution that asked for IDES to be audited specifically during this 2-year period of COVID-19 and pandemic employment assistance. And what they found was published Wednesday: $5.24 billion in overpayments. And something else to add to that is 46 million of that went to those incarcerated and those who were listed as dead. And this has members of both parties pretty upset as to the further detail you dig into this audit. So number one, billions of dollars. And one state senator said that's not hyperbole. It's billions of dollars, $5.2 billion in overpayments. And when you drill down into the report, you also see that the states, the Illinois Department of Employment Security, they did not implement fraud prevention tools as the federal government had suggested. And they postponed implementing those tools until September of 2020. So think of that. From March when the federal government did approve some pandemic assistance above and beyond normal unemployment, they did request states to stand up a new program specifically because of the pandemic. And that's something the state says is on the former Trump administration. But the auditor pointed out that the federal government did give tools to the state to use to fight fraud, but they delayed implementing that from late March to September of 2020. Got to think that window, Dan, was the window where we heard all of these problems. The people who didn't, request unemployment getting it. Who knows how much during that time went out to people incarcerated or to those who are dead. Now we know it's millions of dollars to incarcerated and dead people, and it's $5.2 billion of overpayments. What happens next here? Some are calling for criminal investigations. Some are calling for the third-party vendor that was given a no-bid contract worth millions of dollars that then ballooned into more than $200 million over the span of 2 years that the Auditor General found. Some are calling for that contractor to be held accountable. Either way, there's a lot of people pretty upset as to the scope of just how much of your tax dollars were overspent during the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to unemployment assistance.
I can imagine. I have my own thoughts and feelings on this. I'll keep them to myself. So what's the $5.2 billion? And we're talking about Illinois state-run program by itself. What's the possibility of scraping any of that money back?
It's a great question, especially since if they know that they sent it to prisoners, you can think that, check the prisoners' records. One state representative suggested that, somebody had to approve that. Somebody somewhere had to approve funds going out to whoever the funds went out to. So there probably does need to be some deep forensic investigation. Another state senator told me that he was critical of the Attorney General's office, saying that this should be issue number one for the Attorney General to get to the bottom of. State representative suggested that Illinois State Police need to start going and giving polygraph tests to those who conducted this program and to those frontline IDES employees who may have been involved in, approving these benefits that turned out to be fraudulent. So I think that this is not the last we've heard of this. The governor was asked about it today, Thursday, when he was down in Des Moines for a totally unrelated event. And he talked about, very similar to the statement we got from the Illinois Department of Employment Security, that this was a rushed program brought on by the pandemic, and the Trump administration didn't stand it up properly and required the states to handle it. He did not acknowledge that the Auditor General said that the state delayed implementing fraud prevention tools the federal government proposed that they use for months. And he also did not necessarily talk about how to go and hold people accountable, despite the specific question being asked, who is going to be held accountable for this?
Right. So here it is, late July 2023, 3.5 years from the height of the pandemic when we saw these unemployment spikes. We finally get it, I guess, as you pointed out, it's more of an estimated number because we don't know what we don't know, essentially. Earlier reports were $2 billion. So when this number came out Wednesday, $5.2 billion, that's a staggering increase. Anyway, Greg, I know you and your team are going to continue to hold state government accountable when it comes to this story. What are they doing to claw back some of the money? What can they do to shore up their systems so this never happens again? But why don't we move on, Greg? Got more to talk about because it is Illinois. Also this week, Greg, the AFSCME State Employment Union reached a deal with the state on a new contract, and it's going to cost taxpayers a pretty penny. Tell us about this.
So every 4 years, the state's largest employees union, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Council 31, they enter into contract negotiations with the executive branch. And of course, you got to think, why 4 years? Well, the governor's term is every 4 years. So when Governor Pritzker came into office in 2019, he had to negotiate a new contract back then. Well, now in his second term that started in January, he knew heading into the end of the fiscal year, which was June 30th, that they had to get a new 4-year contract put together with the unions. So July 1st came around, the start of the new budget year, and there was no announcement yet as to if there was a contract. However, the governor did share with members of the media at an unrelated event that they had a tentative deal. He didn't want to give any details. 2 weeks after that, that's when we get the announcement from the governor's office that they have come to an agreement on a tentative deal. And it's going to cost taxpayers over the 4 years $640+ million, with raises over the 4 years of nearly 18%. And just in the first year, it's going to cost $200 million. And before the contract was put together, there were a lot of questions as to if it was going to be a budget buster, because there's not a huge surplus in the bottom line numbers for this fiscal year that started, especially when you consider how much is being spent on pensions, how much is being spent on education, on top of what was spent last year, all of the extra money for the homeless program, for the child care program that the governor put into the budget. Also, you've got increased dollars for subsidies of those who are here undocumented to get health care coverage. So there were questions as to just how much of an impact this would have on the state budget. Will that $200 million this year bust the budget? I guess we'll have to see how the numbers wash out at the end of the year. But you can see that if there are continued increased funding for K through 12 education by $350 million each year moving forward, as is the plan, with the increased amount of money that's going to go into pensions, 1 out of every 5 tax dollar that the state brings in. You can see how increasing the state employee union contract each year for 4 years, it could further crunch the budget, which raises the prospect that some have feared could lead to tax increases. And something else too, when it comes to this 18% raises over 4 years, some are saying that the taxpayers aren't getting that type of raise in their jobs. While they see inflation continuing to be high, they see property taxes continuing to be high, and they see jobs prospects questionable in the future. So it's interesting to see how the economic consequence of a union contract could play out in the years ahead.
Right. And in most state workers, they do a fine job. But government, when negotiating these deals, they have to keep in mind taxpayers and what it means to taxpayers. We're 2 years into what had been 40-year high inflation. Taxpayers who are in the private sector trying to make ends meet themselves need to be considered as part of this. And then there was this $1,200, was it a signing bonus or a stipend?
And that's also part of this, and it's retroactive. So they'll be getting some bonus money, and that's something else that not necessarily every taxpayer out there in the private sector is afforded. But there's also some other provisions about retention and recruitment and training and a variety of other various elements of a 4-year contract for the AFSCME union.
All right. Thank you, Greg, for your insight into that story. Moving on, we have some finality to this ethics complaints against the 2 Illinois Supreme Court justices who were running for office last year. During their campaigns, Governor Pritzker gave each of them $1 million. They were both elected in November, started serving on the bench early this year, and then they both participated in some pretty controversial legislation, determining the fate of some pretty controversial legislation that went before them that Governor Pritzker signed into law, this legislation. They were asked to recuse themselves. They did not. Some ethics complaints were filed against them. Well, we've got a resolution to that this week. Tell us.
Yeah, and there may be even more reporting to be done depending on who takes this ball to the next court. But yes, we've been seeing online letters that people are posting under anonymous social media accounts with who the letter's addressed to scribbled out. And I think that's indicative that some people don't want their information out there for fear of retaliation. What these letters are, they're from the Judicial Inquiry Board. That is a board created by the state constitution to provide an avenue for the public to file complaints against the judicial branch in the state of Illinois. So essentially their role is to field complaints on judges and associate judges and to investigate and possibly sanction such judges and associate judges. The panel of the Judicial Inquiry Board is made up of members appointed by the Illinois Supreme Court and members appointed by Governor, whoever that may be. I checked that list. Governor Pritzker has most of the appointments on there. I think there's one holdover from the Rauner administration, but his term expires later on this year. And they essentially, what we reported on this week was they've been sending out letters to individuals who made complaints based off of what you said out there. These two justices getting $1 million each from the governor, determining the outcome of legislation that the governor signed. People say that there's a conflict of interest in there. There's questions of the court's integrity at hand here. So people complain. And it wasn't just one individual that complained. We talked to one who was willing to go on record with us, but I've got several others who don't want to put their name on it, saying that they also received letters closing the investigation. And no communication's really been had between the complainants and the Judicial Inquiry Board, other than a letter saying we received your complaint, and then weeks later, them saying your complaint is closed. So that doesn't seem to be an avenue, at least from these complainants, that is legitimate or helping with the credibility questions of the judiciary in the state of Illinois. What happens next? I've seen some people argue that this could go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and you got to kind of think legally how that's possible. The U.S. Supreme Court's already ruled on a different matter altogether of a justice elsewhere taking a case when they were the benefactor of a donation from one of those parties involved in the case. And the U.S. Supreme Court did hear that case, and I don't have the specifics as to when they heard that, but it was a while back. So some are saying that this could go that route, especially in the gun ban litigation. And here's what's different about this particular issue. And I know we're running out of time here, but the minutia of this story is important. These two justices elected in November on the bench in January. Two of the high-profile cases was one, the Safety Act and no cash bail, and the other was the gun ban challenge. So the justices were on the bench for both of those hearings. The no cash bail hearing, we got the ruling. The majority opinion, which these two justices were on, upheld no cash bail.
Which was the side of Pritzker. They essentially ruled in Pritzker's favor because he signed that into law.
Correct. Now, the gun ban challenge, the attorney for the plaintiff, Dan Calkins, state representative, he actually did officially file a motion in that case for these two justices to recuse themselves. They refused to recuse themselves, essentially chastising the plaintiff's attorney, saying that there's no substance to the complaints that he filed in his motion to have these justices recuse themselves. So while that was not a motion in the Safety Act, no cash bail law hearing, it was a motion in the gun ban hearing. So that could allow for an avenue. And even the attorney, Jerry Stocks, has said that they'll have to wait to see how the ruling comes out on the gun ban from the Illinois Supreme Court before they determine what their next steps could possibly be, if it's to take it to a different venue, including the U.S. Supreme Court, to specifically address the issue of justices with perceived conflicts taking up cases and deciding on those cases. So fascinating twist and turn here, but obviously it's something that we're going to stay on top of.
So we are still awaiting the the Illinois Supreme Court's decision in the gun ban case.
That is correct. And no indication as to when that's going to be released either.
Thank you again, Greg, but we are out of time. Listeners can keep up with all of the stories we've been talking about and more at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.